Because emotions are so central in the constitution of our being, it means that they connect to everything else, but that doesn't mean that they become invisible. Hi, my name is Frederik Schröer. I work at the Center for the History of Emotions at the Max-Planck-Institut for Human Development, Berlin. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here after previously pursuing my doctoral research also at the center. I currently work on environment and emotions, meaning the role of emotions in the ways in which humans relate to environments and to non-human actors. Very often when I talk to colleagues particularly when I talk to colleagues from other disciplines who are not so familiar with the work that we do here at the center, or that people who are invested in the history of emotions more generally do, their immediate reaction often is, but how do you know how people felt? Because you can't ask them anymore. I think the more interesting question is, what would that even tell us? Right now, in the present, when we are facing one another and we are talking, we might be having the most intense and intimate kind of conversation where we think that we are sharing our emotions, but we will never really know. I will never really know if I know how you feel, and you will never really know if you know how I feel, because we're using language to communicate, and we are using our bodies in ways that we have learned to express our emotions or to hide them. As historians in the history of emotions, we use the very same archives that other historians are tapping. But the kinds of questions that we are asking are perhaps specific in the sense that we are asking after the role of emotions in history. So we are not asking how did someone feel, but what did the emotions that they were performing or observing in others do? What did the emotions do in that moment in time, and how did they do it? So how did people perform certain emotions, and for what ends? Or how did certain emotions make people do certain things in a certain cultural context? Here at the center, and the way that our director Ute Frevert has kind of laid it out programmatically, is firstly that emotions have a history, and that secondly, emotions make history. So the first says that emotions can be an object of historical inquiry. Emotions have a history, meaning that they change over time. The way that we understand love today is not the same way as, for example, Goethe understood love, or people in classical India understood love. The other thing, emotions making history, means that they are not epiphenomena to history, the state of secondary phenomena, that kind of follow after the real movers and the shakers of history have done their stuff and then they're feeling good about it. The argument instead is that we can't separate emotion from cognition as it has been done for a long time. We can't kind of disentangle emotion out of decision making, and therefore emotions are at the very core of what drives history. In addition to that, I think the history of emotions is a field of history or a field of inquiry that is particularly interdisciplinary. A large landscape of methodologies and approaches that often connects to phenomenologies of the body, to the history of the senses, to, say, the history of sports, to the history of media, to silences. Because emotions are so central in the constitution of our being, it means that they connect to everything else, but that doesn't mean that they become invisible. It means that we're really teasing out, in a sense, the connective tissue that binds these different domains of our lives and of our histories together. In my project, Environment and Emotions, I look at a particular group of actors, which is Buddhist Reformers in late colonial South Asia, specifically British India. They are Buddhist Reformers because they react to colonial modernity, but also because they had a particular agenda of reinvigorating Buddhism on Indian soil. And I look at the ways in which these actors, who were comprised of both South Asians from India, from Sri Lanka and other countries, as well as British people and other people who were coming through the networks of colonialism, how they were relating to specific environments in the specific moment of the late colonial period. Many of these environments were undergoing drastic changes that also included environmental crises such as famines, droughts, fires, floodings. And in the way, for example, that these actors were discussing, also archaeological sites such as the Mahabodhi temple, but then also specific trees, specific kinds of trees, the presence of animals or the absence of animals, water bodies, etc. In these ways, I am looking at the human-environment relations that are sort of at the margins of the discourse of these actors. A lot of what these actors were talking about all the time in their periodicals and other sources that we have left from them are very, very intellectual things. They are talking about ancient Buddhist texts, they're talking about psychology, and it seems perhaps at first glance that environmental concerns or ecological concerns were not so central to their life worlds. But then when we take a step back, we see that it kind of creeps in from the margins and between the lines in many different ways. There is this constant recourse to a specific kind of tree that seems to have its own life and its own agency, and that plays a very central role in the way that Buddhists conceived of India as the Holy Land of Buddhism. And you can see different actors coming to these scenes worrying about these things and leaving us with different descriptions, for example, of this tree and the state that it was in. Was it alive? Was it decaying? Was it young? Was it old? Was it the same tree? Was it a different tree? And what I'm trying to do is to follow my actors, not just in terms of their historical trajectories, but also in terms of their thought worlds, the kinds of philosophies and epistemologies that they were accessing. My actors were really going back, making an effort to go back to the early Buddhist literature, could help them cope with their present. So what I'm trying to do on a more theoretical level in my project is I'm trying to deconstruct the kind of hegemonic notion of personhood or emotions that we may carry without being mindful of that, by bringing in other conceptions of, say, how the body is made up of, or if there is a self or there isn't a self, or where the emotions are located inside this kind of airtight interiority space, or are they actually located somewhere else outside of the boundaries of what we typically define as an individual space. In a sense, this project is also a kind of a global history project because it follows the networks of empire. It follows these different actors not only through South Asia and what they did in British India, or especially in the connection between Ceylon, as it was called then, and British India, but also as they connected to eastwards all the way to Japan and westwards all the way to London, but then also Berlin, where we are right now. Tracing these networks and following my actors, following who they are meeting, what they're talking about, what is important to them, where are they going, means also complicating binaries such as the binary between the colonizer and the colonized. Because it becomes really difficult sometimes to slot our actors if we have these very stable categories of these people are the colonizers and those people are the colonized. If we take a figure, for example, such as Anagarika Dharmapala, who was born in Sri Lanka, went to several different schools, including several Catholic schools where he received a British education and a thorough Bible education, then became a leader of the Buddhist Reform movement that in a sense broke with the local religious structures in Sri Lanka, moved to India and made it his life's mission to reinvigorate Buddhism on Indian soil, then it's really difficult to say, was this figure totally colonized or colonizer? Was he kind of profiting of the colonial networks? Does it mean that he had imbibed sort of the milk of colonialism when he was writing his diaries in English? I don't think so, but it shows us that the way that knowledge and practices were circulating at this time in the late colonial period is far more complex than a black and white, this is local, this is colonial, this is the colonized, this is a colonizer. And so different actors that did not only include Buddhists were part of this larger process that I'm looking at, which is really what the colonial period is all about.